Welcome to the AsOne Leadership Podcast. My name's Luke Williams from Follow Baptist Church, and I'll be the host today. And today we have a returning guest. We've got Pastor Graeme Cann with us again. Welcome back to the podcast, Graeme.
Good to be here again.
Yeah, we started last time talking about conflict. You've got a book called Confronting Conflict, which has come out recently, and it's just, like I said last episode, it's just so helpful that if you're in ministry or leadership of any type, it's one of those books you should always have on your bookcase, called Confronting Conflict. And so we had this great conversation in the last episode, or at least I thought it was great. I hope you did as well.
Yes, I did.
But I feel like we just scratched the surface, and in the book there's so much more stuff. And so I thought we'd unpack it and go into a bit more depth today. So in the book, we talked about listening being important in the last episode, and how often in conflict the first thing that goes out the window is listening, because we're wanting to get our point across, and I don't care what you say because I want to tell you how it is, kind of thing. But listening's really important.
Yes.
So in the book you say, and I hadn't heard this before, so it was really helpful. You said that a failure to listen manifests in three ways. A multiplication to the points of aggrievement. B, feelings, suspicions, and interpretations become more important than facts or even the truth. And C, conflict envelops those who have no real interest in the issue but become involved for other reasons such as loyalty or discontent. So I could relate to all of those as you said it. It's not that I haven't experienced it, I just hadn't heard it said like that before. So let's unpack some of those things. So a failure to listen, first of all, manifests in a multiplication of the points of aggrievement. What does that mean?
What it means is that, if I could use an illustration, that perhaps the leadership of a church announces a particular initiative they're going to take, and maybe it's going to they're going to increase the terms of elders, or they're going to change the way business meetings are run in the church, whatever it might be. There's always going to be people in the congregation who are going to listen defensively when that announcement is being made.
Yep.
And they're going to look for the reasons, the imagined reasons why this announcement's being made. So they listen defensively, and then that means they begin to think up or imagine new points of aggrievement.
Yep.
So one might be, the pastor is after power.
Yeah.
Or the elders are trying to grab more power, and they want to dictate the way the church is going to be run. And so we move away from the real issue to all these imagined issues, and then other arguments come out of viewing it in that particular way. So yes, it just simply means that if I'm listening defensively, if I'm listening for a conspiratorially, then...
Which people don't generally do these days.
It's amazing, isn't it? But I saw it in a very large church, a huge conflict developed, and I was outside the church at the time and came in as the minister later. But when I came, I heard all these stories about the elders making a grab for power, and the things they were doing behind the congregation's back, and it was all garbage, but they thought it was real.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. So that's very good. So multiplication of the points of aggrievement. B, feelings, suspicions, and interpretations become more important than facts or even the truth.
Right. So there, in every issue, there is a limited number of facts, but they get pushed to the side by the sorts of conspiratorial theories that we're talking about, and they take their place, and they become much more important than the fact. In fact, what really often happens is that people find themselves arguing against the life of the church on the basis of their feelings rather than walking with the truth. So, for instance, a pastor might say, unity is the most important thing here. What that sounds like to conspiratorial minds is that you just want us all to think like you.
Yeah. Yep.
See? And you want to avoid all the issues. And we've got issues and you won't talk about them because you want unity.
Yep.
Well, that isn't the truth. That isn't a fact. That is not usually a fact anyway. It'd be very unusual. And but then the truth disappears. After 6 months in conflict, nobody really knows what they're conflicting about.
Yep.
It's moved so far from the original idea.
Yeah. Okay. Yep. I've seen that happen before for sure. So C, conflict envelops those who have no real interest in the issue, but become involved for other reasons such as loyalty or discontent.
Yeah, that's right. As a conflict grows, and parties develop, there are reasons why I might feel very loyal to you and you hold a very strong opinion in this area, so I end up supporting you. I might end up, if you left the church, I might even end up leaving it not because of the issue, but because of my loyalty to you. So partyism becomes an issue. So the conflict might exist between the minister and the elders, or the elders and a small group in the church, but in the end it can envelop the whole church. And it can multiply itself into many other different types of conflict going on at the same time.
Yep.
And so a pastor takes a particular stance on an issue. You can imagine some people in the congregation saying, "Oh, I never liked his attitude to the Bible," or "I always thought he was a bit this or a bit liberal," or and all new issues are brought in around it. That is why in conflict resolution, I talked about the fact that what was important was for key people to sit down and talk to each other, to separate themselves from all the dynamics of the argument within the congregation, sit down and say, we're all committed to unity in this church. Let's talk about how we can help, we can deal with our differences and at the same time achieve unity. If an eldership or a board are mature enough to do that, rarely will they have to deal with conflict. But often the maturity is not there, or the urgency of a matter takes over. We've got to decide this now. And sometimes we don't. Sometimes we can leave something for a while.
Yeah, for sure. So those three things come from a defensive posture to something that's going on, that's a potential conflict, and you might not like where something's going, so you get defensive, and these are the things that manifest as a result of that. So what's the antidote to that? How do you stop from having, if you're not happy about a decision or a direction or a stance or whatever it may be, how do you avoid going down that rabbit hole? Because, it can easily happen.
Maybe just before I answer that, to just say that, ask another question, and that is, why is defensiveness so common in church? And I think part of the answer is that as churches, we address almost every personal issue in a person's life. We talk about their marriage, we talk about their relationships, we talk about their morals, we talk about, you know what I mean? And the church has very strong opinions usually about the way life should be lived in that particular way. So members of the church who are subject to that all the time are now suddenly put in a position where there's a decision to be made, and they want to take some control of that. It's like, I've copped it for a year, now I want to make sure that everything happens that in an appropriate and proper way. So people do listen defensively, particularly to things that they're going to vote for or things that they might think concern them. I think I mentioned in the book that I spoke to a man once, and he told me that whenever an issue was voted on in his church, he voted no.
That's just the posture. No.
And then when I asked him why, he said, well, I don't like people telling me how to live my life. So I know I can't prevent that from happening, but I can at least make a statement about it.
Yeah, right.
And so there's some of that goes on. So your question was, well, how do you address this happening? You probably notice in the book that one of the things that happened in the conflict illustration that I use in the book is that the person who was acting as a sort of a mentor to the pastors and to the leaders ask the question, what what are you prepared to do to win this argument? What are you prepared to do to make sure this gets over the line? And what are you not prepared to do? And then the second question that followed that is, if you're committed to the unity of the body, what is it you're prepared to do or not to do in relation to this issue? That's a tremendous question because it helps you prioritize and helps you put the issue in a place where you can ask questions about the issue, like, does it have to be decided now? Is it that important that it's worth dividing the church over? Is there another way of achieving the same goal without causing so much emotional response? It gives you a chance to think that through. Secular business do that all the time.
Yeah, right.
They have people sitting down and saying, how can we, it's not always good, but how can we sell this idea so it raises the least sort of competition or opposition? Well, we're not doing that in the church, hopefully. We want to travel with the truth, but there are times when an idea is being put forward before its time, and there's too much instability in the congregation at that time to push that idea. Like, let's knock down the building and build a new one. It may not be the right time to do that. It might not be the right time for another 5 years. But there's other things that you can do in the meantime to make a stronger community and a more effective church. So it's about stopping and asking the question, what am I prepared to do or not to do? What are our common... You get two people who are having a fight in a church and ask them what they're most committed to, and it'll have nothing to do with the argument. They're committed to the church being evangelistic, or be committed to the Bible being taught, or something, and to come back to some of those and find unity in those is really a helpful thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely, because it makes you realise, if nothing else, how big you're making an issue that's not as big as what you thought it was, because you've got so much in common that you can unite around. So that's really good. So in the book, you talk about toolboxes that pastors can have when dealing with conflict. And one of the tools you mention is readdressing the issue. Now, that sounds scary, because the last thing we want to do is readdress an issue that's been, a thorn in our side or a problem. And I think I can imagine there'd be a lot of people that as soon as they hear that word, go, I don't want to do that. I want to just forget about that. Don't poke the bear again. What does it look like in practice to readdress an issue?
Right. Well, you'll remember that it comes as the third tool in one of the toolboxes. And the first tool in that toolbox was reflection. So what I was suggesting was that the key people in the conflict go away and do some reflecting on their emotional responses, why they're feeling the way they are, why they're acting the way they are. Do they always act when this sort of issue like that, when this issue comes up? And so talk about the importance of reflection, and then talk about the importance of responding to those things that I've reflected on, and changing attitudes and asking the right questions. Readdressing the issue is about coming away from the issue to do those things, and then going back to the issue with a new mindset. So I'm not going to readdress the issue in the same way as before. I'm coming back with a lot more knowledge about why I got upset and why other people got upset, and we're going to look at the issue from that perspective rather than from the upsetness perspective. And so readdressing the issue is important, because if you leave things lie, they will come back anyway. They might come back in a different form. They may come back as a different conflict even. A church I know of had a history of 125 years at the time, and it had conflicts every decade. And
set your alarm. It's coming.
And they just didn't resolve them. And because they didn't resolve this one, then in the next decade, the next one would come up. And very often the same people and the same families were all part of the journey. So I think they need to be addressed, and I think leaders need to spend some time talking to people about how they're responding to the issue, rather than what the issue is. And then once they've done a bit of that, they can go back and look at the issue and say, well, is it a big deal? If it is a big deal, let's resolve it.
Yep. So when you go, before you readdress the issue, you go away and you do all that work. How long does that usually take? Is it just different for every circumstance? Or
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and it's going to take some different dynamics. For instance, if a pastor, sometimes you hear pastors being accused of not listening, and that may be just somebody who's aggrieved, but on the other hand, it might be true. So if I as a pastor have been accused of not listening to a particular perspective, then I need to go away and talk to somebody about, reflect on that, and then talk to somebody about, do I really listen well? Or am I a defensive listener? Am I a controller? Do I want to keep my hands on everything? Because if I am, I will have conflicts on a fairly regular basis, either with the church or with members of my staff or whatever, and they'll just keep repeating. So if I want to have a long-term ministry, I need to understand how I react and how I can change that. And we talked in our last session about whether it be counseling or whether it be mentoring or whether it be coaching or whatever it might be, there are ways of doing that. And I do write a chapter in the book about wounded leaders and talk about the fact that unfortunately many of us are wounded when we come into ministry, but then things happen in ministry that leave us wounded too. And unless we're resolving them as we go, so that we're not taking last year's baggage into this year, then we're going to be exhausted, burnt out, maybe leave ministry altogether, as large numbers do. Yeah, absolutely.
That's very helpful, really helpful. So one of the words you use in the book is demythologizing.
Yes.
Demythologizing. I got that right. It's a big word, but it's an important one to navigate conflict well. As I read the book, I thought it was a fantastic point, but it might be good for you to explain it a little bit more for the listeners.
Right. As we said before, when you let an issue run in a church and other beliefs begin to become more important than the facts, you've got to try to work out what's myth and what's truth. So my illustration in the book was that somebody who was opposing something the elders wanted to do accused the elders of being liberal in their interpretation of the scripture. And that obviously was a myth. You can't demytholize. I think that's a word I made up, and I can't even say it. But you can't do that in the heat of an argument. You can only do that around a table and say, well, this is what you believe. This is the truth. Let's embrace the truth. And there are all sorts of other myths, like the elders are making a grab for power. That's usually a myth. It's usually growing out of this defensive listening. And it's really helpful to decide to go back and strip it down so that you're dealing with real truth. And in my book, I happen to use the illustration of a pastor who wants to bring women onto his leadership team and his ministry team, and that being opposed because it's seen as a liberalization of Scripture. And then the key people sitting around the table saying, what are we all committed to? What are the common ground that we're committed to? And let's get rid of all these other ideas and fears and anxieties because they aren't part of this. No, that's really helpful. So thankfully in churches, conflict's never an issue because we love one another above ourselves. We flow in the fruits of the Spirit. We're united powerfully by the gospel. But imagine a world where divisive conflict does happen in a church, does exist in a church. Why do you think that would be the case when we've got the power of the gospel and we've got all the work of the Holy Spirit and we are thinking more about others and ourselves? Why do you think that would
exist.
That's a good way to put it all. Somebody said to me, why on earth would you write a book on conflict for the church? I think he had his tongue firmly planted in his cheek. The reality is that when you come to matters of faith and belief, they are hugely emotive issues. So if it's important to me that the Bible is the inerrant word of God, then the moment you as a pastor or another leader suggest it's not, it might have some errors in it or whatever you might suggest, then I am honor bound to fight you over it.
Mm.
I have to stand. This is how we think in the church. We have to stand for the truth.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter what other things we damage in that. We might damage a relationship. We might damage the love in the body, but we do it.
Mm.
Now, I think it's just the nature of church and that nature of faith that our belief system is life and death issues. They're life and death issues.
Yep.
And they foster huge emotion, great emotion. So if I grew up believing a certain thing and that's now being challenged, like the women in ministry issue does, and that is being challenged, then the reality is I've got to stand up against it because that's part of my belief system. It's as much part of my belief system that as Jesus died on the cross. In fact, it might be more important. You know what I mean? It becomes something I can defend. I can make a difference to.
Yep.
So I think that is primarily the reason. The other reason I think too is that there is a certain vulnerability that we create in church congregations. That is, we talk about all being sinners, for instance, or we own the fact that we're not perfect, that we have particular habits that we shouldn't have, or we can get caught up in addictions, and we talk about that quite openly, you know, and that should be a healthy thing, but it creates this vulnerability where I feel a little bit like when there's something I can commit, that I can be committed to as an ultimate truth, then I'm going to fight hard for that. I can't argue with you that I'm not a sinner, but I can argue with you that the authorized version is the only version of the Bible you should read. You know what I mean?
Yep, for sure.
I hope I don't offend anybody with that, but that
You probably will.
that is the way it works. And so I think somewhere there are some issues in that too.
Yep. So two other issues you raise in the book are anger and control. So I think we've all seen those in a conflict situation. You see them as primary causes of tension. So we've heard a lot about these in the church worldwide in recent times where, you know, pastors have fallen through their anger or their control over people or women or whatever it may be. How can we address these issues and bring accountability around them?
Oh, how many sessions have we got? I think there's probably something that needs to be said at the beginning of answering this question around the idea that we have to change the relationship that exists between a pastor and their leadership. I think, you know, whether we use the board idea that you have a board and they look after the management aspects of the church and the pastor looks after the ministry, or whether we have deacons or whether we have elders, whatever model we have, there is a tendency to breed into that structure the potential for control and anger to control a great deal of what happens.
Mm.
So there's certain things we wouldn't say in this meeting because the minister is a bit sensitive about this, so he gets angry about this, so we don't talk about that.
Yep.
Or, I've got 2 or 3 people on my oversight, they really belong in the 19th century, and we don't talk about those. There's that sort of stuff is going on under the surface all the time.
Yep.
I think we've got to change that. I think we've got to come to a place where we're all servants. We're all body parts first, and body parts of the body of Christ, but we are servants of God. We sit around and we develop a atmosphere of openness and honesty together. That the minister isn't keeping his powder dry because he's going to be assessed every year or he's going to get a recall in 5 years. Just openness and honesty. If it starts there, it will seep through the whole church all the time. The reason I know this works is that when we developed the Christian community at Elkanah, I was probably by nature a controller. And I had run things up to then in my life by making decisions really quickly, on the run, gets things done, mop up the mistakes later, but get it all done.
Yeah.
But we decided that the whole community would make decisions about everything. So a decision that I could make in 5 minutes would take 6 months.
Yeah.
and it just about drove me crazy. But over a period of 16 years, we saw something grow there that I've never seen grow in a local church. And it was this complete openness to each other and a trust that was not built on keeping my powder dry. It was built on transparency. And I think church leaderships need to sit down and think about how can we be more transparent with each other? How can we make sure we pray more often together than we do? How do we share our hopes and our dreams in a way that, in a place that feels safe and nobody's going to rip them down before we've talked about them? How can we deal with change without seeing change as a bad thing?
Yeah.
Why should we as Christians be fearful of change?
It's the whole thing about a Christian life, isn't it?
Yeah.
We're meant to be changing all the time.
Yes.
Being transformed.
And but we are very fearful of change, and anger comes out of fear.
Yeah, no, very interesting. So at the end of the book, you have this really helpful chapter where you talk about future-proofing the church against divisive conflict, which my ears pricked up and I thought, this would be a good one to look at. So do you want to just give us briefly some overarching principles to future-proof a church against divisive conflict?
Yeah. I think my first point in that chapter was that one of the most important changes that we need to make is moving back to Jesus' vision of the church and the apostles' vision of the church, which was about the church being a body and being a temple, and we being living stones and holy priests. And I put forward the idea that seeing ourselves more as an organism rather than as an organization would give us permission to change the way we actually deal with conflict in the context, in the spiritual context.
Yep.
And that takes a lot of work because churches have office bearers, they have roles and functions just the same way as any other organization. An organism has body parts, it has functions, it works together, each part relies on the other part. And so that means decisions are often made differently in a church that sees itself as an organism. They're not handed down from above, they are shared with the people it's going to affect the most. It's prayed over, it takes longer, but it nevertheless is a way of ensuring that you're going to be able to deal with differences without them becoming divisive conflict. And differences, I don't think the church deals with differences until they become conflicts often.
Yep.
And we avoid differences because they might become conflicts. And there are differences that we need to talk about. If there are two elders on the same board and one is very much a structure person and the other one's very much a spontaneous person, then that's a difference.
Yep.
Now, they could go their whole life on that board and never talk about it. But if they talked about it, they'd have less hassles.
Yeah, there'd be a lot of tension all the time, wouldn't there?
Yeah. They'd be understanding why that person reacts the way they do.
So it's a lack of transparency and a lack of willingness to talk about those differences and acknowledge them, and maybe even acknowledge the strengths of the different styles, I guess.
That's right. We were invited to a church in New Zealand to help them work through a very, very divisive thing that had arisen. And it had arisen around the difference between the two pastors. And the senior pastor, who was a lovely man, a beautiful man, with a great pastor's heart. And he was the senior pastor, so he was expected to run the church. And he was given all the jobs a senior pastor would do in his office and making decisions about insurances and whatever. And the other pastor, the young pastor, also a very lovely man, he was the pastoral pastor because he was the junior pastor.
Yep.
And he had a mind like a steel trap. I mean, he was an organizational person. And the church hadn't recognized this, but these two men now, because of this, were in conflict. The senior pastor was always telling the young pastor that he wasn't looking after the people properly, and the young pastor was always telling the old pastor he wasn't running the church properly. And when I went there, I said to the elders after a while, I said, "This is not their problem. This is your problem. This is a systemic problem because you are not pastoring these people. You're not talking to them. You're not helping them work through this." So we did an Edwards personal preference test, which tests you for what your emotional preferences are. And these two guys came out just as you would have expected them to. And I'll never forget the meeting where the elders said, "Why don't we change these two around? Why don't we make our senior man the senior pastor with his primary role pastoring, and we make this guy the executive pastor with his primary role running the business of the church?"
Yep.
Well, I don't know where they are now, but 10 years later they were still working together and the church was going well. And I think it was because they acted like a unit. And like I'm saying, they acted like a body.
Yeah. And there's things that need to be done, but this part's going to do that part better, and this part's going to, this part will probably eat better, and that part there will kick the footy better. Yeah. So, get them in the right spots. Yeah.
I knew a Baptist pastor once who discovered he talked a lot about gifts, and he realised his gift was ministering to people one-on-one. And they found out that the local pharmacist's gift was teaching.
Yeah, right.
And he ended up doing most of the preaching.
Interesting.
That was his voluntary role.
Yep.
And the other guy was loving the people and pastoring the people.
Yeah, wonderful.
What a courageous pastor.
Yeah, absolutely. To hand that off to someone else. Yeah, definitely. Got to have a level of security there, don't you? For sure.
That's right.
Very good. So I'll finish this last one. So conflict is obviously something that most people dread. I was talking to a friend this morning on the phone. He said, "I hate conflict." I said, "We're doing this podcast." He said, "I just want to avoid it." And they'll do anything to avoid it. But I've found some blessing when it can be done well. I've also found when it's not done well, the pain of that. Really? But when it's done well, there is some blessing to be found. So do you think conflict can present opportunity? And if so, what could those opportunities be?
Oh, yeah, I certainly do. As I said before, I think talking about differences is a really important thing. And I think we should use that word honestly to describe the fact that we will all have our own ways of seeing things. And that is not a bad thing. It's only a bad thing because we allow those differences to become causes of conflict. So I think, one, if we understand that we have differences and we've got the courage to talk about them and to particularly with the people we're working with, then that's really helpful. Secondly, I think conflict a more aggressive discussion about differences is not necessarily a bad thing either. But it's a bad thing when somebody is intimidated by someone else's aggression. But you and I could probably sit down and have a really energetic debate about something and still be friends.
Yep. Footy teams or something like that.
Yeah, that's right. Yes. Well, there isn't any debate. Essendon's the best team. But
God. The debate is whether you can be a Christian and barrack for Essendon. That's the debate.
So what was I going to say? So we could do that and grow even stronger as friendships because we enjoy that. But and sometimes then such a debate might be necessary. There may be an issue where somebody is clearly wrong and someone is trying to do something that is going to be really harmful to the church. And I think that's times when the more aggressive debate type thing is good, but we should still learn how to do that well.
Yep.
The one thing we should be avoiding is divisive conflict. And that's where we pull back to our own fortresses and we fight from there.
Yep.
And we have to see that there is no place in living in Christ-like lives for that. Jesus didn't do that either. He had some pretty strong debates, particularly with the Pharisees.
Yep.
And he didn't hold back. He called them empty tombs and
brood of vipers.
But by the same token, there was always this wonderful balance of his love taking him across barriers and across cultural barriers and so on, and how fantastic that was to see, and that's where we have to be, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Graeme, there's so much gold in there, and there's even more gold in the book. So I think people should grab it. It's called Confronting Conflict, From Emotional Reaction to Thoughtful Response, which is beautiful. That's what we want in our churches. That's what we want in our lives, in our families, and our friendships, all that sort of stuff. So definitely worth grabbing a hold of that. So they can go to graemecann.com and you can purchase it there. And I really recommend you do. I think it's one of those books that I'd recommend to everyone. I think you should all have it on your shelf. So some great stuff in there. So we really appreciate you being part of the AsOne Leadership Podcast. We hope that you found it helpful. Obviously, conflict is one of those subjects that's become, more common in recent years, and I think all of us have dealt with it in different ways, and it's good to learn about it. So I hope you found this really helpful. I know I have, and I encourage you to get the book. Thank you for tuning in. You can always go and watch this episode on YouTube at the AsOne Leadership Podcast page. You can subscribe there and like that, and you can make comments there. Also, you can listen to it on Apple Podcasts or anywhere you find your podcast. Please go and share it with others if you think there'd be people that would find it helpful. And we look forward to bringing more helpful content to you in the near future. Thanks a lot for tuning in.